Hello and welcome to Artful Inquiry, the Edinburgh College of Art's podcast where our leading academics discuss their cutting-edge research in the fields of music, art history, design and architecture. I'm Dr. James Cook, Director of Research, and today we're going to be talking about the topic of musical torture. So to begin with a trigger warning, obviously topics that will be discussed include torture, bullying and psychological violence. So the topic that we're talking about today is when music is torture. And we're joined here by Morag, who's been based at the Reed School of Music since 2017. You may know her as the author of, I suppose, a rather more pleasant topic, the book on Auld Lang Syne, published in 2021, or indeed as a writer on the musical avant-garde of the 1950s and afterwards. However, a lot of her most recent work for the last 15 years or so has been focused on the topic of how music has been used to facilitate political and collective violence, including in war and in cases of torture. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So before I turn to Morag, I think we're going to have a listen to a little bit of music first. So, Morag, welcome. Was that torture?
No, that wasn't torture. That was a piece by a former colleague, as it were, of ours, Hans Gál, who was a lecturer here for many years in the late 20th century. Hans Gál was an Austrian composer who was also Jewish and who managed to escape after the Nazi takeover of Austria together with his family, but was in danger of being sent back to Nazi Germany. This is before the outbreak of the war, until Professor Donald Tovey, after whom the Tovey Chair of Music at the Reed School of Music is named, he intervened, got some employment for Hans Gál in Edinburgh, and that is how he came to be based in Edinburgh and ultimately went on to be one of the founders of the Edinburgh Festival. The piece that we've just heard wasn't a piece of torture. It was a piece by Hans Gál that was, however, written in a context of detention, because Hans Gál, like most of his compatriots, Germans and Italians, regardless of the reasons why they were in the United Kingdom, they were interned in 1940 following the outbreak of World War II. And this piece is called the Huyton Suite. It's named for a newly completed at that point housing estate just outside Liverpool, which was used to inter a lot of these people for a short period in 1940 before eventually they were moved to an internment camp on the Isle of Man, where Hans Gál then spent the rest of the summer until, fortunately, the government decided that actually Jewish refugees should not be locked up, and Gál was one of the first to be released. The particular moment that we heard from that piece, and this is from a recording performed by 3 of our students at a concert we had last October here, it's interesting because he integrates the sound of the bugle call for Reveille. So that is something that he actually would have heard in the Huyton camp. And it's an interesting example because it demonstrates one of the things that we will talk about today when we're talking about music and torture, is how many practices that are associated with the military, with military music, military discipline, military camp life, are then kind of carried over into situations where it's actually civilians that are being detained or people being held prisoner. So it is an example, although it's not an example of torture, it indicates how the military calls were something that were part of Hans Gál's daily life as an interned prisoner, and something that ultimately made it into this beautiful piece that he wrote for two violins and flute, because that was the only instruments he had available.
I suppose it's interesting to see how the broader sonic conditions of detention there are being used as sort of found music within his own composition there.
Exactly. And this particular concert that we staged last October, called Behind Bars, as part of the UNESCO Week of Sound, was specifically to draw attention to the work that's going on here into the sonic conditions of all forms of detention, in order to draw attention to the fact that very often, even in cases where we're not talking about torture in the stricter sense, the way that the sounding environment is set up or just exists in these places can in some cases constitute a form of ill treatment against detainees, and something that's very, very harmful to their well-being. And so what we did at that concert was to integrate a lot of music and a lot of songs that were created in situations of detention, and specifically where the detainees themselves are reflecting on aspects of that sonic environment. So in this case, it's the sound of the bugle call that Gál integrates into his piece, and that was one of the main reasons why we used that.
So I suppose an important part for the start of our discussion today is, what exactly do we mean by music torture? I suppose we probably tend, especially as us as musicologists, to have fairly positive associations with music, and I suppose probably for the general population there's an assumption that music is good, even if it is music that you don't like. So yeah, I suppose, what do you mean by music torture?
Well, I'll give you a kind of a more legalistic definition in a minute, but just maybe to respond specifically to that point about how can we imagine music as being a form of torture. I think most people at some point in their life have been in the situation where they've had a neighbour who liked to play music at all times of the day or night, and possibly on a loop, and possibly played very, very loud. Or you've maybe had it just on one or two occasions, but it's the night before an important job interview, or when you've got an early flight or something like that. And you feel very, very frustrated in that situation. If it is something that happens time and time again, then it can really mess with your sleep patterns. Also because you're expecting that noise to happen, and so you're always in this state of tension, wondering when it's going to start. Imagine in that situation that there is literally nothing you can do about it. You can't have a nice word with your neighbour and ask them and just say, do you realise how noisy that is? Is there any chance you could turn it down? You can't, go to your landlord. You can't, if things get really bad, you can't go to the police and make a formal complaint. You can't move house. You can't go and stay in a hotel that night. You can't improve the soundproofing in your flat. There is nothing you can do. You are basically exposed to that sound continuously with no escape from it, and also knowing for certain that this is something that is particularly being played in order to have that psychological impact on you. And I think that is, for most people, hopefully, that is the closest they're ever going to come to any kind of form of torture. But that is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So torture is absolutely prohibited in international law. It's prohibited. There are literally no exceptions. There is never any time in which it is feasible to torture somebody or allowable to torture somebody under international law. When I say music torture, I use that kind of as a shorthand to talk about ways that music has been used in forms of torture and also in other forms of cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. Now, that is a term that comes from international law. In the international laws on torture, torture is banned together with other forms of cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment that might not meet the legal test for torture. That's all a very legalistic description. There are debates amongst lawyers as to where that defining line is between the two, but both are absolutely prohibited because both are assaults on human dignity and on the essential worth of a human being. So I use it to kind of cover both forms. And what we're talking about here, the one example I've just mentioned, is a form of forced listening. So that is exposing people to the sound of music there can be many reasons why that is done as part of techniques of sensory overload and sensory deprivation. It might be a way to induce sleep deprivation just like the issue with your neighbour. It might be done so that when you hear that music in future, you're always reminded of that situation of detention and the torture that you experienced there. There's another form as well, however, another major form, and that's forced performing, mostly forced singing. But in some cases, it can also be being forced to play music on an instrument. It can also be being forced to dance for your captors. It can be being forced to march or perform other physical activities to music. That is potentially even the more widespread form. And although it doesn't sound very harmful, it is something that is often very humiliating, very degrading, and in some situations is done in such a way that it is also a form of physical violence. So, for example, when people are exhausted, when they're malnourished, it is then inflicted on them, and it is another thing that is draining them of vital energy. Or they might also be made to sing or to dance or whatever in positions that are actually physically painful to do that in. So it's by no means a lesser of the two evils. But that is the two forms that we tend to experience with many variations in terms of how they tend to be applied in certain situations and the reasons why they're used and the kinds of impacts that they can have.
There's two aspects there. The one is maybe the more sort of scientific, the properties of the sound. So either very large volume or perhaps a frequency that is uncomfortable, which is causing, I suppose, sort of pain or not letting you sleep, versus the sort of more psychosocial thing of something to do with the content of the music, which is offensive to someone's sensibilities or, yes, it's some other way degrading.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting point there because you talked about the actual physical volume of it being potentially something that can cause harm. What we tend to find is that the actual volume of music or any kind of sound is used is not typically at a volume which would actually directly cause damage to your hearing if you are otherwise a healthy person. You have to also bear in mind that in some of these situations, or very many of these situations, the torturers, the captors, are listening to this music as well. So obviously it can't be anything that's going to cause them physical damage. But what you do have is that constant exposure in such a way that you can't get away from. And as you also kind of said, in some cases, then there is a use of particular music that is offensive or has some other kind of content that makes it particularly resonant in that context. There isn't any one common denominator in terms, for example, of genres of music. When we talk about the use of music and torture, far from it. The one common denominator is that it's always music that has some kind of relevance culturally or politically in that context. So, for example, particularly in situations of political conflict or nationalist conflict, it will be songs that are, patriotic songs of the side that's doing the torturing. It could also be, in some cases, forcing people to sing their own political songs as a form of humiliation. So, for example, going back to the Nazi concentration camps, there were reports of prisoners who were communists, and that was why they were imprisoned, having to sing the communist anthem, the Internationale, as they were literally digging graves and digging their own graves as well. But it's not exactly what people tend to think, that there is some kind of very carefully engineered scientific form of music that causes the torture. It's all about the implications of that music, and it's all about the conditions in which it's actually played. And it's never on its own in those conditions. It's always with other forms of torture or other forms of ill treatment, and it's the combination of those things that makes it so difficult to deal with and ultimately then meets the threshold for torture or ill treatment.
I suppose there's a sort of insidiousness to that as well then in your life, hopefully, assuming you have a life post-detention. Yeah. But it's, I suppose, thinking of a very fictional example there, but sort of Clockwork Orange there, where part of the psychological damage that is done is turning music the character loves into music which makes them physically sick. And I suppose this must be part of the problem, which is that you go back, hopefully, to your normal life, but have these terrible connotations with possibly quite normal things that you are likely to hear when shopping.
And let's not forget that Anthony Burgess, who was, of course, the author of the novel A Clockwork Orange, spent a lot of time with the British colonial powers in Malaya. at precisely the time when the British government and the British forces were beginning to use psychological techniques of torture against the anti-colonial uprisings in a lot of these countries. So that there is a very, very direct connection there between Burgess's work and the kinds of things that we're talking about. And it is sadly the case. That is one of the reasons why, some forms of torture you could use any kind of sound, but music has particular characteristics. And one of them is that you are maybe more likely to meet that same piece of music again in the future. There are some cases we know of where torturers have specifically said to the people they're torturing, we're playing this piece of music again and again, so that once you're released from here, you will always think back to this place whenever you hear that piece of music again. I was talking one time several years ago to some therapists who worked with Kurdish refugees who were working in Vienna, who were living in Vienna. And at the time when they had left Turkey, many of them had spent time in prison, where at that point the Turkish government would routinely be forcing people to sing patriotic Turkish songs as part of the ill treatment that they meted out and the part of the torture that they meted out to these people. And this therapist said that she'd never really thought about it until she started to talk to me and to think about the ways that music is used in torture. But she did know that some of the people that she treated would actively avoid certain parts of the city where there was lots of Turkish Austrian people that were living there because they were afraid to hear certain really common, really popular Turkish songs that these Turkish people would just be playing, because that's just, that's the kind of music that they would play. But for these people who had been held in prison in Turkey, that would then potentially re-trigger their trauma again. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with long-term as well. And it's these psychological long-term effects that make this such a serious issue as well.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the degree to which this is obviously something that requires detailed, very specialist work. But I suppose I'm wondering what it was that was your motivation, having sort of worked previously on Stockhausen and writing about Auld Lang Syne. What is it that got you into this topic yourself?
I have always been very politically interested. I've always been very interested in human rights and very active in the field of human rights. And there was basically a point where those two interests started to come together. I started to notice, particularly when I was writing the book on Auld Lang Syne, I began to read a lot of the research that had been done into the use of music, and particularly song, in the Nazi concentration camps, which was one of the first areas where this was really researched in depth. And that is basically where I then started to think more about the connections between music and violence. And this led me into doing lots of different types of research to do with war and genocide as well. And torture specifically, there was a point in round about 2010 when there had been a lot of reports coming out about the use of music and torture in the USA's so-called war on terror. There had also been a lot of newer research at that point, as I mentioned, dealing with the ways that music was used in Nazi concentration camps. And at that point, in the research group that I led in Germany, I was contacted by the musicologist Anna Papayetti, who was working or beginning to work on the roles of music and sound in torture in Greece in the 1960s and 1970s. And she wanted to come and base her work on that in my research group. So starting from that point, we thought, well, let's have a little workshop to explore this topic. We quite often had workshops just to kind of think around lots of different issues around about the topic of music and violence. And to prepare for that, we undertook a little scoping exercise just to see how many other examples or what other examples we could find of uses of music in punishment, in torture and ill treatment. And what we noticed and what we continue to notice now is that immediately you scratch the surface, you start to find all sorts of examples. And because of that, then we went from having that initial workshop idea and let's just have a look and see if there's anything else that needs to be done here, to that becoming really one of the major focal points of that research group. And it's something that has stayed with me just now. It's not research that I enjoy doing by any stretch of the imagination. It is a type of research that as with anything to do with war and violence, it can have quite a negative effect also on you as a researcher. But I can't lay this one to one side until I'm sure that that research is going to not just be, mouldering in university library archives, but it's actually going to have a real world impact, because that's the human rights activist part of me. I want to see guidelines. I want to see this being talked about in terms of the prevention of torture and prosecution of people who've been tortured, and activism for the rights of people who've been tortured.
I was interested there to hear that you sort of started with the Nazi concentration camps, which is a very particular context, of course, and I think you quite rightly you say it is one of the first areas that people went to. It helps that you've got things like Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, which is created in those conditions and has gone on to be a mainstay of part of the canon. It sort of gives people a way into examining the opposite side of that, I suppose. And then looking again at the sort of musical torture in Greece in the 60s and 70s is a quite specific context. Do you find that there are shared patterns here? Is there a kind of a long history of music torture? Is there a point at which this starts, or is this just sort of human nature to use sound in these ways?
I suspect that to the extent that it is potentially human nature to inflict violence on other humans, and I'm saying potentially there because that is something that is discussed quite a lot, whether this is something that is natural or is something that is culturally honed. And also certain culturally learned things. I mean, I absolutely believe that war is a cultural phenomenon. We could not wage war without there being a whole range of cultural practices and ritual practices and beliefs that have grown up around that, which enable that to happen. But to the extent that there has ever been torture, shall we put it that way, and ill treatment, then I suspect that there has always been some forms of the use of musical communication, if I can put it that way, in amongst that. Again, sometimes it's an example from everyday life that brings this home to you. The playground bullying taunts, the na na ni na na. That's a little piece of musical communication right there. There seems to be something quite fundamental, at least in our own culture, that makes us resort to a musical form of communication when we really want to show to somebody that we've got one over in them, that we despise them, that we think they're really silly. And it's a very, very visceral, if you've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment, there is something particularly visceral about it. There's no comeback to that kind of a taunt. You can't come back with an equally clever taunt. It just kind of stands there on its own. So I do think that, as I've said, whenever you start to scratch the surface, you find all sorts of things. We know certainly from the European Middle Ages, which we kind of like to think about as being, the high point of torture, which I unfortunately don't think is the case. There are lots of ways in which music and musical symbolism becomes integrated into those kind of torture practices as well. So, for example, some of the instruments of torture that survive from at that time are fashioned in the shape of musical instruments, which is partly to do with the connotations of music and noise. There's a big history in European cultures of using noise and music in certain punishment rituals to symbolise, the harmony of society versus the disruption to that harmony that's caused by the person who's being a criminal or, being a woman or whatever they're doing. But the other aspect of that, obviously, is that there's an added level of humiliation and mockery as well by forcing people to wear this thing that looks like a violin or that looks like a flute or a trumpet or something like that. You also have things like bell collars. So these are little attachments that people would be made to wear, little head collars that have a bell on them, which means that every time you move your head, a bell rings. So you are, on the one hand, always forced to hear that bell anytime you move, and that also then causes you to not want to change position. So that's another example of how sound has been used going way back. Most of the research that's been done on this topic has focused on the 20th century onwards. It's a lot easier to research that for numerous different reasons, even from the perspective that Obviously, since the Second World War, when you've got a new raft of international human rights laws, you have organisations such as Amnesty International that has started to systematically research the use of torture. It becomes much easier then to research these things. And the other side of that is that there are certain methods of torture that have been more systematically developed and honed from the Cold War onwards, including some of the forms of using music. So that is mostly what people tend to think about. I've also done research into military justice and military punishment rituals in the 17th and 18th century. And there are a lot of connections there in terms of these military practices. And that's quite important when we move forward even into the 20th and the 21st centuries, because these kind of connections carry on, as we've already discussed. So, for example, we know the phrases such as drumming somebody out of the army. That would literally have been somebody being drummed out, so accompanied to the gates of the camp by the drummers. We also have the use of drums being played running the gauntlet, very typically another military form of punishment, where the prisoner was made to run between two lines of soldiers, each of whom had belts or switches or things like that would hit them on the way past. And the interesting other connection point in between these is that traditionally, as I say, this point in kind of early modern Europe, the drummers are actually responsible for issues of military justice and military discipline. So your head drummer would very often be the person who was also ultimately in charge of meting out different kinds of punishments. And in certain countries and in certain contexts, for example, in flogging, which in Britain wasn't banned in the army until the 1880s, it would be the drummers in infantry forces that would actually have to carry out that punishment of drumming. So there's very, very complex connections going back through history. In terms of the commonalities that we find, touching again on the medieval practices, the symbolic use of music, the connections in the military between music and justice, these are things that also resonate when we come through into the 20th century as well. I think one of the most interesting things for me to look at or to think about is, what does this actually do for the torturers? What are they getting from these practices of torture? What are they getting from using music in this context? And very often you do see music being used in ways that is, if you like, ritualising the performance or providing a kind of a soundtrack to that performance and to that communication. And I've said here, unwittingly, I've said performance because it is kind of like that very often in violence. Violence is always some kind of form of communication. It isn't just senseless violence. There's always something that's being communicated through that violence. And you do very often find that particularly quite extreme forms of violence tend to be framed in such a way that they do seem like little performances. And something like having music there as this kind of script to help you do that. That kind of ritualisation of the practice is something that you find in a lot of different cases, as well, of course, as the fact that it's always about imposing the power of one person over another, and also the fact that so often it's tied up with ideas of humiliation and mockery and degradation.
That's an interesting one. I suppose I was thinking of connections there between the documentary George Gitto's Soundtrack to War about the use of music in the Second Iraq War, which seemed often to be used in precisely those contexts. It gave a soundtrack that enabled people to sort of disassociate, or at least it enabled them to carry out acts that they would not otherwise be able to do.
It is the kind of thing, just to talk specifically about the use of music in warfare as well. What you find nowadays is that, particularly when you come closer to combat situations, we now don't generally have formal uses of music in those contexts. But what we very often find is that combatants will actually almost recreate those rituals, which we know existed in the military and martial cultures in previous years, exactly as you say, to give some kind of frame to the violence, and also to help people, as it were, package it off into something quite distinct that they can then kind of process emotionally for themselves beforehand, sometimes during the acts themselves, and also afterwards.
I suppose it continually, in the way that we see violence portrayed in screen media, film and video game, it normally is associated with a particular soundtrack in itself as well. So even if we've lost some of the curated performative aspect from the military there, we've sort of got a ready-made one in media associations that you have that people can then bring themselves to make it bearable.
Absolutely. And also because of that idea that is portrayed in these films about, the heroic aspects of warfare or the toughness and that kind of thing, that's another thing that people can kind of use the music for, particularly torture. Torture is obviously a very different situation because in torture, there's no threat to the torturers in that situation. They have the absolute power. But there again, that idea of being able to psychologically enjoy that power, as it were, for your own benefit by having this loud music is very important. Another really important aspect about music torture, switching back to the side of the victim, is that it provides a presence of that torturer even when they're not there. And that's one of the big differences between music and other forms of sound that you might find in situations of detention are also used in torture. So we quite often hear in some of the ways that music has been used in sensory overload techniques in the late 20th century, that people talk about the sound that sounded like it might come from an electricity generator or air conditioning or something like that. So it's not, although this sound was something that was very difficult to them, it's quite difficult even from our perspective as researchers to know, was that intentionally a part of the torture if it wasn't? When you start to play music, even though you can have 100 reasons for playing that music, it's always an intentional act. You've always made that decision to play that music, to switch on that recording, to choose that recording or to turn to that particular radio station. So for the people who are exposed to that sound, they always have that music there as that presence of the torturer, even when they're not physically in the room. It's almost as if they are being imprisoned by that sound themselves. Even in instances of forced performing as well, we often find something similar in situations where people have been told that if they don't sing a song perfectly, if they get the words wrong, if they sing out of key or something like that, then they will suffer physical punishment, or they might even be killed if they do that. And that forces them to start to practice, sometimes manically, in their own time, even when otherwise they would have a chance to retreat and to recuperate, because they're so terrified of getting it wrong, of being in that situation again where they have to sing perfectly. And there again, what you find is that, you're inflicting it on yourself, but you're inflicting this presence of the torturer on yourself through this musical act. So it's something that is very, very insidious in that way as well.
Slightly related point, but that way that we use sound and music sometimes to kind of claim spaces, and I suppose with sort of my medievalist hat on, I'm thinking of the way that sort of the sounds of the bell is used in a medieval Renaissance city to kind of project the power of the church further, and the way that I suppose other artwork is, if you don't want people urinating on part of your city, you stick a nice picture of the Virgin Mary on it, and then they won't. But kind of use of art and music to claim areas, and we still see it today, of course, with playing loud classical music outside of shops so that young people won't possibly want to stay there, which has its own problematic aspects. But yeah, I suppose this idea of using music to claim ownership of a space is kind of connected here, but I suppose the difference is that you can't get away.
Exactly, you can't get away. It is absolutely, it's claiming not so much this space in terms of the physical space of the cell, it's claiming the space inside the person's head. It's claiming ownership of their personality, their subjectivity, and that is what torture is designed to do. It's designed to destroy the person, the actual, the way, the ability to independently think, to independently act, to have your own beliefs, your own feelings, all of those kind of things. That is what a torturer is trying to get at. And so, yeah, it is actually a closely related example. It's just that the space that is being controlled is a very, very different one, and one with obviously absolutely devastating consequences.
So you've talked about wanting to get, I suppose, your work to make a difference. There's not just to be research which sits on a shelf that maybe we talk to other researchers or our students about, but something which has a genuine impact on policy and that can try to make a difference in people's lives. And I know you've recently started a project to sort of try to push this forward. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the concert that I mentioned earlier with the beautiful performance of the Huyton Suite by Hans Gál was one of the launch events for this new project, which is being carried out in connection with the law school in Edinburgh as well. My colleague there, Dr. Casey McCall-Smith. And it's looking at the environmental conditions of detention and how they have an impact on detainees' well-being. And in my case, obviously, particularly the sonic conditions of detention. So it's not simply focusing on the situation of torture, but it's drawing attention to the fact that the sounding environment is something that has a really big impact on people's health and well-being. And there really isn't enough awareness of that when it comes to places of detention such as prisons, such as secure homes for children, secure hospitals, asylum detention camps, all of those kinds of places. To give you an idea of just how little awareness there is of this, there's a set of rules published by or passed by the UN. They are standard minimum rules for prisoners. These were revised in 2015. They're now known as the Mandela Rules after Nelson Mandela. And although these rules go through, a lot of different things, kind of basic minimum conditions that you have to ensure that prisoners are living in. There are references to lighting, to temperature, all of those things. There is not one single mention of sound in the entire document. And even though these rules were being developed and were ultimately published at the time when there was so much media coverage of how music had been used in torture by the US forces, and there was finally, there was a debate happening about these kinds of issues. And that is basically where this new project is kind of trying to go. It's hopefully going to raise awareness around these issues, draw attention to some of the problems that there might be, and to hopefully create a situation where we maybe have revisions to guidelines, additional guidelines, some kind of understanding at the level of monitoring organisations that monitor conditions in detention, those kind of things, that these things are actually also really, really important. Fortunately, we are in a situation just now that generally there is a move towards better understanding of just how important these kind of environmental aspects are to ensuring the general health and well-being of detainees, but also specifically to helping to prevent abuses, including torture. So it is quite a good time to be starting this work. But in my experience also as a musicologist, it can sometimes be very, very difficult to make people aware, not just of the importance of sound, but also the fact that music isn't necessarily always something that is good, that it is something that we also have to be aware of potentially as something that can harm people as well in certain conditions.
Thank you, Morag. I suppose I'm wondering what the next steps are then for this research.
Well, last week we had a workshop which was attended by a number of experts, national and international experts in prison conditions and human rights law, to discuss the existing guidelines that we have, but also exactly those areas where there's a lack of definition in the guidance that goes out to monitoring authorities. So we're in the process of drawing the discussions from that day together, generating a report on that basis that we then hope to be able to distribute very widely, and then also use that to think carefully about what are the next steps, what strategically is the next thing that we need to do moving forward.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for sharing your important work. I think what we'll do now is end with Hans Gál again, and I suppose a slightly more positive slant on some music. If you'd like to find out more about the research project discussed in today's episode, you can look at the show notes here on Spotify. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about research at ECA in general, please do look at our website at www.eca.ed.ac.uk/research. If you've enjoyed this episode of Artful Inquiry, please do hit the subscribe button now to be notified of new episodes in the future. And of course, do share the podcast with people who you think might enjoy it. All that remains is for me to thank our guest this week, Dr. Morag Grant, and of course you, our listeners. Next week we'll be talking to Professor Richard Williams about the Expressway World Revisited.